his hands clenched into fists. The dimly lit apartment felt suffocating. The air thick with unspoken words and the weight of something he couldn't quite name. Jimin sat across from him, his expression unreadable, his fingers loosely curled around a glass of untouched water. Silence. The kind of silence that stretched too long, that scraped against the walls of Jungkook's patience. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, and for a second he thought Jimin would say something. Anything. But the older man simply exhaled softly, stood up, and walked away. Jungkook's chest tightened. There it is again. That emptiness in his eyes. Say something. Jungkook's voice cracked. His own desperation disgusted him, but he couldn't stop. Just once. Tell me you care. Jimin paused, his back still turned. Then, with a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, he murmured, "Maybe you were never supposed to need me." And then he left. Jungkook didn't know why that night haunted him so much. Maybe it was the way Jimin's voice had wavered at the end, or the way he had walked away like a man carrying something too heavy for words. But one thing was clear. Jimin had always been distant, cold, unapproachable. And yet, something didn't add up. Days turned into weeks, and Jungkook tried to move on. He told himself he didn't care, that Jimin's absence meant nothing. But that was a lie, and he realized it the day he found the box. It was in the back of Jimin's old room, left behind after he moved out. A simple, unmarked box, shoved deep inside the closet as if it was never meant to be found. Jungkook almost didn't open it, but curiosity won. Inside, he found stacks of old letters. Some sealed, some crumpled as if they had been written and then discarded. His breath caught when he saw his own name scrawled across the envelopes in Jimin's familiar handwriting. With shaking hands, he picked up the first one. Jungkook, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but if you do, I want you to know. His heart pounded as he unfolded the letter, eyes darting across the words. And then he froze, because what he read changed everything. The world outside the window was a blur of neon lights and pouring rain. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Jungkook sat on the cold wooden floor, the box of letters open beside him, his fingers trembling as they hovered over the fragile paper. He could hear his own heartbeat, each pulse echoing like a drum against the silence. He swallowed hard, then unfolded the first letter. Jungkook, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but if you do, I want you to know. The ink was smudged in places, as if Jimin's hands had hesitated, pressing too long against the paper. I want you to know that I tried. Jungkook's breath hitched. His grip on the letter tightened, his mind racing to piece together the meaning behind those words. He forced himself to keep reading. I tried to be there. I tried to stay close. But every time I reached out, I felt like I was only pulling you further away. And the sentence cut off abruptly. A thick, black line of ink ran through the words, as if Jimin had scribbled them out in frustration. Below it, in smaller handwriting, Jimin had written, "It doesn't matter." Jungkook's chest ached. He reached for another letter, unfolding it with shaking fingers. Do you remember the first time we met? You probably don't. But I do. I remember every detail. How you smiled too easily. How your laughter filled the room. I told myself that I wouldn't get attached. That you were just another passing moment in my life. But I was wrong. Jungkook's vision blurred. His hands clenched the paper tighter, feeling the weight of every word pressing against him. I used to think I was protecting you by keeping my distance. That if I stayed quiet, if I buried everything, it would hurt less. But I was wrong about that too. Jungkook wiped at his eyes angrily. He didn't understand. Why hadn't Jimin ever said any of this? Why had he chosen silence over these words? His hands moved on their own, reaching for another letter. This one older, the edges yellowed. It was sealed. His fingers hesitated over the flap before he tore it open. Jungkook, this might be the last time I write to you. I don't know how much longer I can do this. His breath caught in his throat. I wonder what you'd say if you knew the truth. Would you hate me? Would you walk away? Maybe that's why I never told you. Maybe I was just a coward. Jungkook's fingers dug into the paper, his pulse hammering in his ears. He flipped the letter over, scanning desperately for more, for something, anything that could explain. But there was nothing. Just an unfinished thought. A sentence left hanging in the air like a whisper that had never been spoken. He reached for another letter. And another. Each one chipped away at the image of Jimin he thought he knew. The Jimin who had always seemed distant. The Jimin who had walked away that night without a second glance. But now Jungkook knew. Jimin hadn't walked away because he didn't care. He had walked away because he cared too much. A sob tore from Jungkook's throat before he could stop it. The sound felt foreign, raw, broken. His chest ached as if something inside him had cracked wide open. For the first time in weeks, he let himself cry. Because Jimin had been right there all along. And Jungkook had never seen it. He gripped the letters to his chest, his body shaking. And for the first time since Jimin left, Jungkook realized he had to find him before it was too late. The night air was sharp, the cold biting at Jungkook's skin as he walked through the empty streets. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. His hands, still clutching the crumpled letters, were trembling. The weight of what he had just discovered pressed against his chest like an invisible force, suffocating him with every step he took. Jimin had been there all along, caring, watching, holding back words that could have changed everything. And Jungkook had never noticed. The thought burned him from the inside, an unbearable ache settling deep in his bones. He needed to see him, now. But where was Jimin? Jungkook's mind raced, searching through the past few months for any clue, any hint of where Jimin might have gone. After that night, after their last conversation, Jimin had disappeared. No calls, no messages, nothing. It was as if he had simply erased himself from Jungkook's world. But Jungkook refused to accept that. He had to find him. He pulled out his phone with shaking fingers and scrolled through his contacts, stopping at Jimin's name. He hesitated for only a second before pressing the call button. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. The number you are trying to reach is unavailable. Jungkook cursed under his breath. He tried again, and again. Each time, the same automated voice answered him, driving his frustration higher. His mind spun. If Jimin had changed his number, it meant he didn't want to be found. But Jungkook wasn't going to give up. He shoved the phone back into his pocket and took a deep breath, forcing himself to think. Where would Jimin go? If he was trying to disappear, he wouldn't stay somewhere obvious. Then, a memory surfaced. If I ever get tired of everything, I think I'd go somewhere quiet, somewhere no one would think to look for me. It had been a casual conversation, a passing thought Jimin had shared one night when they were younger, sitting on the rooftop of their old apartment building. Jungkook had laughed at the time, teasing Jimin for being dramatic. But now, Jungkook ran. His legs moved before his mind could catch up, his heartbeat hammering in his ears as he sprinted through the city streets. He didn't care about the cold, didn't care about the burning in his lungs. He just knew he had to get to him. By the time he reached the old rooftop, his breath was ragged, his chest rising and falling in heavy gasps. He shoved open the rusted door and stepped out into the open air. And then, he saw him. Jimin sat on the edge of the rooftop, his legs dangling over the side. His shoulders were hunched, his head tilted slightly downward. The wind ruffled his dark hair, and for a moment, Jungkook could almost pretend that nothing had changed, that Jimin was still the same person he had always known. But something was different. Jimin looked smaller, tired, like a man who had been carrying too much for too long. Jungkook swallowed the lump in his throat and took a slow step forward. Jimin. The name came out softer than he had intended, barely more than a whisper. Jimin didn't move. Jungkook's hands clenched at his sides. He had spent weeks trying to push down the emotions swirling inside him. Anger, confusion, guilt. But now, standing here, looking at Jimin's fragile silhouette against the night sky, all of it broke free. Why didn't you tell me? His voice cracked. He didn't care. Why didn't you say anything? Jimin finally turned. His eyes were tired, hollow. I didn't think it would matter, he said simply. Jungkook felt something inside him snap. Didn't matter? He stepped closer, his breath uneven. You think all of this doesn't matter? That you don't matter? Jimin exhaled a quiet laugh, though there was no real amusement in it. I didn't want you to feel obligated to care, he murmured. Jungkook's fists tightened. His nails dug into his palms, the sting grounding him. You idiot, he whispered. You absolute idiot. Jimin blinked, startled. Jungkook took another step forward. His voice was shaking now, but he didn't stop. You think I wouldn't have cared? You think I wouldn't have noticed? He gestured to the letters, his hands trembling. I found these, Jimin. I read everything. And now I can't stop thinking about how much pain you must have been in. How much you hid from me. Jimin's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Jungkook sucked in a shaky breath. You were never cold, he whispered. You were never indifferent. You were just... He swallowed the lump in his throat. You were just too scared to let me see. Silence. Then Jimin let out a breath. It was shaky, uneven. I was, he admitted. Jungkook stepped closer. Jimin didn't move away. There was something raw in his eyes, something vulnerable. And for the first time, Jungkook saw it clearly. The weight Jimin had been carrying. The years of silence. The quiet suffering. And he hated himself for not seeing it sooner. Jungkook hesitated for only a second before reaching out. His fingers curled gently around Jimin's wrist. I'm here, he said. I'm right here. And I'm not going anywhere. Jimin's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Jungkook held his breath, waiting. Then slowly, so slowly it almost broke him, Jimin's fingers curled back around his. A silent answer. A quiet plea. Jungkook squeezed his hand tighter. He didn't know if he could fix everything. He didn't know if words would ever be enough. But he did know this. He wouldn't let Jimin carry this alone anymore. He wasn't going to lose him. Not again. The rooftop was silent, save for the distant hum of the city below. Neon lights flickered in the distance, their glow reflecting in Jimin's dark eyes as he stared down at the street. His fingers still curled weakly around Jungkook's hand. Neither of them spoke. Jungkook's heart pounded, but he refused to let go. Jimin's wrist felt fragile in his grip, cold, as if he had been standing here for hours, lost in his own thoughts. The quiet between them stretched on, heavy with everything they had never said. And then, finally, you shouldn't have come. Jimin's voice was soft, but the words cut like a blade. Jungkook's jaw tightened. You really think I wouldn't? Jimin didn't answer right away. His fingers twitched slightly against Jungkook's. He didn't pull away, but he didn't hold on either. I don't know, he admitted. His voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know what you would have done. I don't know what you're thinking right now. Jungkook exhaled sharply, his grip tightening. Then let me tell you. Jimin's gaze flickered toward him. I'm angry, Jungkook said, his voice rough. Angry at myself for not noticing sooner. Angry at you for thinking you had to go through this alone. And more than anything, I'm angry that you thought. He cut himself off, shaking his head. That you thought you didn't matter to me. Jimin swallowed. It wasn't about that. Then what was it about? Jimin didn't answer right away. He turned back toward the city, his expression unreadable. Jungkook waited. The wind picked up, brushing through their hair, cold against their skin. Then, I didn't want you to feel responsible for me, Jimin murmured. Jungkook flinched. Responsible? Jimin inhaled deeply, his shoulders rising and falling. I didn't want you to feel like you had to take care of me, like you owed me anything. He hesitated, his fingers twitching against Jungkook's. I thought, if I stayed quiet, if I kept my distance, then maybe you wouldn't feel guilty. Jungkook felt something in his chest crack. Guilty for what, Jimin? Jimin finally turned to face him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jungkook saw the raw emotion in his eyes. For not feeling the same way. The words landed like a punch to the gut. Jungkook froze, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. Jimin looked away quickly, his jaw tightening. Forget it, he muttered, pulling his wrist free from Jungkook's grip. I shouldn't have said that. Jungkook barely registered the loss of warmth before he was reaching out again, grabbing Jimin's wrist, firmer this time. Look at me. Jimin hesitated. Jungkook's grip didn't loosen. Look at me. Slowly, reluctantly, Jimin turned his gaze back to him. Jungkook's chest ached. He didn't know what to say, what to do. He wasn't sure he even understood the full weight of what Jimin had just admitted. But he did know one thing. He had never, ever wanted Jimin to feel this way. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Jimin let out a hollow laugh. You don't have to say anything, he murmured. I already know. Jungkook felt his pulse stutter. Know what? Jimin exhaled. That you don't feel the same. Jungkook's breath caught. I told myself it was fine. Jimin continued, voice steady despite the quiet pain laced in his words. That as long as I could stay by your side, it wouldn't matter. But then, he let out a soft, humorless laugh. Then I realized it did. And that's when I knew I had to go. Jungkook's grip on Jimin's wrist tightened. So you just left? Jimin's gaze softened slightly. What else was I supposed to do? Jungkook swallowed the lump in his throat. You could have told me. And then what? Jimin shook his head. What would you have done, Jungkook? Would you have pretended? Would you have stayed out of pity? Jungkook flinched. You know I'd never. But you would have felt guilty, Jimin interrupted. You do feel guilty. Jungkook's jaw clenched. Damn right I do. Jimin exhaled softly. That's why I left. Jungkook stared at him, his mind spinning. His chest felt tight, like he couldn't quite catch his breath. For so long he had been angry. At Jimin, at himself, at the silence between them. The scent of warm broth filled the small apartment, mingling with the faint chill of the night air that seeped in through the slightly open window. The world outside was restless. Cars honking, distant chatter of pedestrians weaving through the streets. But in here, in this tiny, dimly lit space, it was quiet. Too quiet. Jungkook sat across from Jimin, watching him push his food around the bowl. The dim glow of the overhead light cast soft shadows across his face, highlighting the tired set of his eyes, the subtle downturn of his lips. You should eat, Jungkook said, voice softer than he intended. Jimin hummed, but he didn't lift his chopsticks. Jungkook exhaled, his chest tightening. It was strange, this newfound closeness between them. A closeness that felt fragile, like a delicate thread stretched too thin, threatening to snap at any moment. Jungkook knew Jimin was trying. He knew that they were trying. But the weight of their past still lingered in the air, an unspoken presence between them. He wanted to say something, to reassure Jimin, to tell him that he wasn't going anywhere. But every time he opened his mouth, the words got stuck in his throat. So instead, he reached out. Slowly, hesitantly, he took Jimin's wrist. Gentler this time, not with desperation, not with urgency, but with quiet reassurance. Jimin stilled. His fingers twitched slightly against the table, but he didn't pull away. Jungkook swallowed. You don't have to talk, he murmured. But at least eat. Jimin's lips pressed into a thin line. His fingers curled slightly, but he nodded. Jungkook let go. And this time Jimin ate. The hours passed in quiet companionship. They didn't talk much. Jungkook stayed on the couch, watching the city lights flicker through the window, while Jimin busied himself cleaning up the dishes. It was a strange routine, but it felt safe, like something neither of them had realized they needed. Then, somewhere between the quiet clatter of dishes and the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator, Jimin spoke. I had a dream last night. Jungkook turned his head, watching him. Yeah. Jimin nodded. He didn't look at Jungkook, focusing instead on drying his hands with a small kitchen towel. It was about the night I left. Jungkook's fingers curled against the fabric of the couch. What happened? Jimin exhaled, setting the towel down. In the dream, I was standing at the station. It was raining. He let out a humorless laugh. I remember thinking how dramatic it was. Like something out of a movie. Jungkook's throat tightened. He hadn't been there that night. Hadn't known Jimin was leaving until he was already gone. I kept waiting, Jimin continued. I kept thinking, Maybe you'd come. Jungkook inhaled sharply. But you didn't, Jimin finished softly. A heavy silence settled between them. Jungkook closed his eyes for a brief moment, guilt pressing against his ribs. I didn't know, he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. If I had, he swallowed hard. I would have run after you, Jimin. I swear I would have. Jimin finally looked at him then, his expression unreadable. Would you have? Jungkook's jaw tightened. Yes. Jimin held his gaze for a moment longer before he sighed, dragging a hand through his hair. It doesn't matter now. It does, Jungkook shot back. It matters because you left thinking I didn't care. Jimin's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Jungkook pushed forward, heart pounding. I know I can't change the past. I know I can't take back the time we lost. But I do care, Jimin. I always have. Jimin sucked in a shaky breath. Jungkook swallowed, his voice softer now. I just wish I had realized it sooner. Jimin looked down, his fingers gripping the edge of the counter. Me too, he murmured. Jungkook exhaled, his chest aching. Then carefully he stood up. Slowly, he crossed the small space between them, stopping just a breath away. Jimin tensed but didn't step back. Jungkook hesitated for only a second before he reached out, brushing his fingers against Jimin's wrist. I don't want to keep pretending like we can just move on without talking about it, he murmured. We need to face this, Jimin. Together. Jimin inhaled sharply, his fingers twitching beneath Jungkook's touch. Then slowly, hesitantly, he nodded. And for the first time that night, Jungkook let himself hope. The rain drummed against the window, a rhythmic sound that filled the small apartment with an eerie kind of stillness. The city outside was alive with its usual hum, cars rushing through wet streets, distant voices merging into an indistinct murmur. But inside, it was just the two of them. Jungkook sat on the couch, elbows resting on his knees, fingers loosely intertwined as he stared at the floor. His mind was a whirlwind, replaying Jimin's words from the night before. I kept waiting, but you didn't come. Jungkook had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it. The image of Jimin standing alone in the rain, waiting for something that never came. Waiting for him. Across the room, Jimin sat by the window, his fingers tracing absent patterns against the cold glass. His eyes were distant, lost in a past neither of them could change. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was fragile, a thread stretched thin between what was and what could have been. Then, I don't remember the first time I realized I was in love with you. Jungkook's head snapped up, his breath caught in his throat. Jimin still wasn't looking at him. His voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a blade. I think it was always there, Jimin continued, fingers still moving against the window pane. Like a shadow. Something I never noticed until it was too late. Jungkook swallowed, his heart hammering against his ribs. Jimin, I spent so long pretending it didn't matter. Jimin interrupted, his voice steadier now, convincing myself that it was enough. That just being near you was enough. Jungkook felt something tighten in his chest. But it wasn't, Jimin murmured, and I hated myself for it. Jungkook pushed himself up, his hands curling into fists. You shouldn't have. Jimin finally turned to face him. What else was I supposed to do? Jungkook froze. Jimin's eyes were dark, stormy with emotions Jungkook couldn't even begin to unravel. You never saw me that way, Jimin whispered, and I couldn't keep pretending like I was okay with that. Jungkook's breath stuttered. His mind was spinning, caught between everything he had once believed and the truth unraveling before him. Because Jimin was wrong. So wrong. Jungkook had seen him, had felt something he had been too blind, too scared to name. And now, standing here watching Jimin lay himself bare in a way he never had before, Jungkook couldn't stay silent anymore. He took a slow step forward. You think I never saw you, he murmured. But that's not true. Jimin stilled. Jungkook swallowed, his throat tight. I saw you every damn day. I just didn't know what I was looking at. Jimin's breath hitched. I thought Jungkook exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I thought what I felt was just, I don't know, friendship, attachment. But it was never just that. Jimin's fingers curled against the windowsill. Then why didn't you say anything? Jungkook let out a quiet, bitter laugh. Because I didn't know. Jimin's expression wavered. I was an idiot, Jungkook admitted, voice thick with regret. I didn't see it for what it was until you were gone. Jimin swallowed hard. And now, Jungkook's jaw tightened. Now I don't want to lose you again. The words hung between them, raw and unfiltered. Jimin's breath trembled. Jungkook. Jungkook closed the distance between them in slow, deliberate steps. He hesitated for only a second before reaching out, his fingers brushing against Jimin's. Jimin didn't pull away. Jungkook took a shaky breath. Let me make this right. Jimin's lips parted slightly, his eyes searching Jungkook's for something. Hesitation, uncertainty, a reason to step back. But there was none. And for the first time, Jimin let himself believe it. Jungkook wasn't letting go. Not this time. The night was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the wall. The rain had stopped hours ago, leaving behind the scent of damp asphalt and the ghost of lingering thunder in the distance. The city outside was slowing down, but inside Jimin's small apartment, everything felt unnervingly still. Jimin sat on the edge of his bed, fingers pressed together, gaze fixed on the floor. Jungkook was still there, not just in the physical sense, standing near the doorway with his hands stuffed into the pockets of his hoodie, but in every corner of the room, in every breath Jimin took. He was there in the way the air felt heavier, in the way Jimin's heart pounded too fast, too loud. Jungkook had said it. I don't want to lose you again. Jimin had wanted to believe him. God, he wanted to. But the weight of their past still clung to him, thick and suffocating. Jungkook shifted, exhaling slowly. You're shutting me out again. Jimin closed his eyes. I'm not. Yes, you are. Jungkook's voice was gentle but firm. I can see it. Jimin inhaled sharply. It's not that simple, Jungkook. Jungkook stepped closer. Then explain it to me. Jimin clenched his jaw. How was he supposed to explain something that even he didn't fully understand? That the scars left behind from their years of distance weren't something that could be erased overnight? That even though Jungkook was saying all the right things now, a part of Jimin still feared that it was too late? That maybe, just maybe, he didn't know how to let himself be wanted anymore. Jungkook sat down beside him without a word. The bed dipped under his weight, the warmth of his presence pressing against Jimin's side. He didn't touch him, didn't force anything, but he was there. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, when did you start resenting me? Jimin's breath caught. His fingers curled into his palms. I never resented you. Jungkook scoffed, but there was no humor in it. Don't lie to me. Jimin exhaled, shoulders tensing. I didn't, he said again, quieter this time. I got tired of waiting for something that was never going to happen. Jungkook's expression flickered. Jimin swallowed hard. You don't know what it was like, Jungkook. To be there every day, feeling the way I did, and knowing you would never look at me the same way. Jungkook's throat bobbed. Jimin shook his head. You don't have to say anything. I don't blame you. His voice was steady, but Jungkook could hear the exhaustion beneath it. You can't help how you feel. Jungkook's fingers curled against his thighs. But I was wrong. Jimin hesitated. Jungkook turned to him, his gaze unwavering. I did feel something, Jimin. I just didn't know how to name it. His voice was tight, thick with frustration. I was a coward. I spent so long convincing myself that what we had was enough, because I was afraid that if I admitted it, if I acknowledged what was really there, I would lose you. Jimin's breath trembled. And the irony is, Jungkook continued bitterly, I lost you anyway. Jimin squeezed his eyes shut. It would have been easier if Jungkook hadn't said anything. If he had let Jimin continue believing that he had been alone in it all along. But now Jimin didn't know what to do with the weight of those words. Jungkook exhaled sharply. You don't have to believe me. I know I don't deserve it. But I'm not leaving. Jimin's hands clenched into fists. Don't say things you don't mean. Jungkook reached out then. Not hesitantly, not cautiously, but with quiet, unshakable certainty. He curled his fingers around Jimin's wrist, just enough to ground him. I mean everything. Jimin's pulse stuttered beneath Jungkook's touch. Jungkook wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't asking for immediate trust, or for Jimin to let go of the past overnight. He was simply asking him to stay. And maybe Jimin could try, just this once. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound filling the small apartment. Outside, the city never truly slept. Flashes of headlights cut through the darkness, and distant voices blended into the ever-present murmur of life. But inside these four walls, the world had shrunk down to just the two of them. Jungkook hadn't moved. Neither had Jimin. The air between them was thick, tangled with everything they had said, and even more so with everything they hadn't. Jimin's wrist was still trapped in Jungkook's hold, his pulse fluttering beneath steady fingers. He should pull away, but he didn't. Instead, he let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment settle deep in his chest like an ache he had grown too familiar with. Then finally, say it. Jimin blinked. What? Jungkook's grip on his wrist tightened just slightly, as if afraid that if he loosened it, Jimin would slip away again. His gaze was steady, unwavering. Say that you don't want this. His voice was quiet, but firm. Say that you don't feel anything, and I'll let you go. Jimin's breath caught. Jungkook wasn't playing fair. Not when he was looking at him like that. Like he had already made up his mind, like he had already decided that losing Jimin again was not an option. Jimin tried to scoff, to conjure up some sort of defense, but the words tangled on his tongue. Because he couldn't say it. Because it would be a lie. Jungkook exhaled sharply. You can't, can you? Jimin clenched his jaw, looking away. He hated this. Hated how easily Jungkook could see through him. Hated how, even after everything, his walls crumbled so effortlessly under the weight of that gaze. Hated how much he still wanted. Jimin. His name sounded different coming from Jungkook's lips. Softer. Almost reverent. Like a plea. Like a promise. Jimin inhaled shakily. You don't get to do this, he murmured. You don't get to show up now, after everything, and expect me to just... He cut himself off, frustration bubbling to the surface. I don't know how to do this, Jungkook. Jungkook's fingers twitched against his skin. Then let me show you, he said simply. Jimin let out a humorless laugh. It's not that easy. Jungkook frowned. Why not? Jimin's throat tightened. He pulled his hand free, standing abruptly. The room felt too small, too suffocating, and he needed space. Because, he started, pacing toward the window. Because it took me so long to get over you. His voice cracked slightly, and he hated himself for it. And now you're here, saying all these things, looking at me like... He sucked in a sharp breath. Like you mean it. Jungkook stood too slow and deliberate. I do mean it. Jimin let out a bitter chuckle. And what if I can't believe you? Jungkook stilled. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then I'll wait. Jimin's breath hitched. Jungkook took a careful step closer. I'll wait as long as it takes. Jimin squeezed his eyes shut. Don't say things like that. Jungkook's voice softened. Why not? Because I can't afford to believe you, Jimin admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Not if you're going to leave again. Jungkook inhaled sharply, stepping closer until there was barely a breath of space between them. I'm not leaving, he said. Jimin forced himself to meet his gaze. You say that now. Jungkook exhaled, reaching up, slow, deliberate, until his fingers brushed against Jimin's cheek. Jimin stiffened, but he didn't move away. I can't change the past, Jungkook murmured. But I can fight for this. For you. His thumb traced the sharp edge of Jimin's jaw. And I will. Every day, if that's what it takes. Jimin's eyes burned. His chest ached with the weight of everything. Of the years of longing, of the missed chances, of the fear still clinging to his ribs. But Jungkook was here. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. For now.